Well, good evening, everybody. I think the academic 5 minutes are past, and it's a pleasure to see you all here this evening. Also, those who are participating online. And it's a great pleasure in particular in these times of war and scandal to have with us Michiel van Hulten, who is the director of Transparency International in Brussels and has had a distinguished career as a member of the European Parliament, an EU official, somebody who's worked with NGOs, Voter Watch, was it? And generally has been active in the EU-oriented policy community now for many, many years and has accumulated terrific experience. And in the middle of all kinds of goings on, as you can imagine, between Ukraine, Turkey, Qatar Gate, and numerous other such issues, has taken the time to be with us this evening. So we're going to start out this evening with a dialogue in which I'm going to pose a few questions to Michiel, and then we will open up for your own questions and comments, both those of you who are here and those who are online. For those who are online, please put your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. And I've got my eye on it, and I'll filter that into the conversation. Well, Michiel, there are several places that we could start, but maybe we should just start with Transparency International, your organization. If you could just give us a little bit of background into Transparency International, its history, its goals, the way it functions, and then I think we'll come to the other issues in due course. Anyway, welcome. Delighted to have you with us this evening.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for coming to listen this evening. So Transparency International was founded 30 years ago, exactly this year, and it's an organization that fights against corruption. It was founded by a number of people, organizations, countries that were concerned about the way corruption was impacting on the social and economic developments of large parts of the world. And Transparency International was set up in order to fight the corruption that the people who founded it at the time believed were undermining this progress. And that mission really hasn't changed. The mission of Transparency International continues to be to rid the world of corruption. And it's an organization that has a presence in over 100 countries. We call them chapters, national chapters. Each of these chapters tends to be a homegrown organization that's developed in response often to specific concerns about corruption in that country. And those organizations can then apply to join the TI franchise, if you like, the global franchise, adopt the Transparency International brand and become part of the movement. The secretariat is based in Berlin, and the secretariat coordinates the work of the movement globally. It's where the priorities for the next years are set, and the office in Brussels is somewhere in between. We're not a national chapter. We're also not part of the headquarters in Berlin. But our role is to influence the policies of the European Union and to monitor the work of the institutions themselves from a political integrity perspective. So we are the voice of Transparency International in Brussels, and we try and convey as best we can the position of the TI movement to the European institutions. There's basically three areas of work that we focus on in Brussels at the moment. The first one is the political integrity of the EU institutions themselves, and that's where we deal with issues like Qatargate, which we can come back to separately. The second area is improving financial and business integrity, and there we work on things like improving anti-money laundering legislation at the European level, dealing with oligarchs, kleptocrats who park their money in the European Union and finding ways to identify that money and send it back to the victim populations that were stolen with, but also, for instance, on improving corporate integrity, making sure that corporations don't engage in illegal or corrupt practices, and promote good governance in the work that they do. And then the third area we work on now, and that's kind of a growing area in the last few years, is what we call rule of law and civic space, which is all about defending the rule of law in the European Union itself now, which never was a major concern, but is a big concern at the moment, as you know, and protecting civic space, making sure that organizations such as TI itself, but also other organizations, as well as, for instance, the media, can do their work effectively, because that's also an area that's under threat, and it's critically important, not just for those organizations, but also for society as a whole, that there is freedom of the press, that there is transparency, and that civil society actors are able to operate freely without hindrance, in order to make their contribution to society, to influence politics, and to try and influence other societal actors. So those are really the three pillars of work that we work on. We have a team of right now 14 people, a mix of research, advocacy, communications, and apart from Qatargate, the other big area that we're looking at now is the European Parliament elections, which are coming up next year, which will be a big opportunity to help set the agenda in the EU for the next 5 years.
Would you say that corruption is like the overarching concept, the fight against corruption, or is corruption one problem among several? You listed various areas you're working in, and sometimes with students we write a paper, start with definitions, right? So corruption, abuse of power, rule of law, freedom of speech, are these sort of parallel concerns? Is the predominant concern corruption? And what do we really understand by corruption as such, as distinct from some of these other challenges?
But the definition we use for corruption, and there's lots of variations, is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So that's the definition that we use, but there are many variations on the same theme. I think our definition is pretty good in the sense that I think people understand it, and it allows us to look at a whole range of issues that are covered by that definition. Yes, there are other issues, but I think that our focal point, our starting point, is always corruption. How do we address the scourge of corruption, and what tools do we need in that? But of course, when you discuss that, when you look at the tools you need in order to fight corruption, I already mentioned, for instance, freedom of the press. And we as an organization, as an anti-corruption organization, cannot do our job properly if there is not also a free media that's able to help us expose the wrongdoing that's identified. And in fact, very often we work together with journalistic consortia in order to investigate specific cases of wrongdoing or conduct specific investigations. So that's one example. Another example, of course, is the courts and having an independent judiciary, because there's no point in trying to fight corruption if you can't convict people of crimes that have been committed and punish them and make sure they don't happen again. So there's a whole range of issues that come together in order to be able to work effectively on fighting corruption.
And when you look at the European Union, its institutions, and then behind them, the member states, how would you sort of rate them, broadly speaking, on a sort of global scale in terms of corruption? I mean, my impression, having worked for a long time in those institutions, and I tell people, but I hope there's a good basis for it, that it seemed to me that corruption in this sense that you gave with your definition, very much oriented towards personal gain, I always felt was a relatively minor problem in the institutions themselves. Is that an illusion? Or especially when compared with certain other systems or even certain member states? But is that the sort of golden age that never was, or is that a fair judgment? Or
you mean in the European institutions?
yes.
Yes, it's a good question. I think that there's obviously degrees of corruption, and there are ethics issues or integrity issues that that aren't defined as being cases of corruption. And there's plenty, I think, of those kind of issues. I think I've spoken in relation to Qatargate, and previously when the European Parliament appointed a new Secretary General by way of a process that wasn't very transparent, I spoke about institutional corruption. And I think that's probably a problem, a bigger issue, if you like, for the European institutions than individual cases of corruption. And by institutional corruption, I mean that the processes by which decisions are taken within the institutions are sometimes subject to are sometimes conducted in a way that doesn't meet the high standards of integrity that you would expect of a public institution. And sometimes these processes have become so ingrained, people are so used to them that they don't even see them anymore. And I think, for instance, the process of senior appointments in the European institutions is a case in point, because people have become so used to the idea that, for instance, you need to allocate certain top jobs to people of a specific nationality or of a specific gender or of a specific background, that they no longer recognize the fact that they've lost sight of the need to submit all the candidates to a process of vetting, of interviewing, and of finding the best candidates, because the process has become so much one of bartering and negotiating that's no longer evident to them. So I think that's more of a problem, I would say, in Brussels than corruption of people trying to line their pockets.
Yeah. And I guess because the EU is still maybe kind of permanently a body in the making, which needs to constantly establish its legitimacy with the public. You mentioned elections coming up in the European Parliament next year. There is some skepticism about the political legitimacy of the institutions. The Commission is not an elected body, it's responsible to an elected body, and all the rest of it. So perhaps even if at the level of individual corruption, it may not face the degree of corruption you see in some, even of its own member states possibly, and certainly countries around the world, maybe it's more sensitive and more important than the mere figures might suggest in the EU.
I think the unfortunate problem for the European institutions is that they have to perform better than the national institutions. National parliaments, national governments have acquired legitimacy over the ages, and they're not in a constant battle for approval from the voters. They don't constantly have to defend the mere fact of their existence. And so every time there is a scandal or a crisis of the kind we've seen with Qatargate, it makes people question the raison d'être and the legitimacy of the institution as a whole. And so any kind of scandal that occurs has a much bigger impact, I think, in Brussels than it does in equivalent cases at the national level.
Right. Are you all more or less familiar with this Qatargate story? Yes, I see lots of nodding of heads, so we don't have to tell the story. But an Italian friend here who was a professor until recently, University of Bologna, he sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, well, 1.5 million, what is this by comparison with Panama Papers and so on. And he said, I echoed it in the little article that I wrote, he said, well, it was the sight of those piles of banknotes that did it and attracted the media attention. If you just read that there have been bank transfers of vastly superior sums, nobody pays any attention. How serious is a scandal like this for the EU?
Well, I think it's really serious. I mean, I think I've been in Brussels for over 25 years, and I've never seen anything like it. I think the response and the public interest has been overwhelming. I think partly for the reason that you mentioned, that it's very visual, and it's easy for people to become interested in what is going on. And so I think that it's kind of speaks to people's imagination, if you like. So I think that for that reason, it's really potentially extremely damaging. Of course, I think damage has already been done that can't be fixed. But I think there's an opportunity at the same time for the EU institutions and the European Parliament in particular to use this as a way to reform many of the problems that do exist and that contributed to this scandal happening in the first place. And if they seize that opportunity, if they use the chance to reform, then it could be something that they go to the voters with next year and say, look, we messed up terribly, but we fixed it, and we're deserving of your trust. And we're really in that phase now of seeing whether the parliament is serious about the reform process, because they said all the right things when the scandal broke, and they put up a plan on how to reform the parliament. The question is, will this plan be implemented, and will it be enforced? And I think obviously the jury is still out on that.
Yeah, I've encountered quite a bit of skepticism about that. I mean, what would it take, really? Change of mentality? I mean, if you change the rules alone, a new code of conduct or new rules, I mean, what kind of new provisions could really limit this sort of problem in the future? What type of measures could be taken?
One of the key things we said is that it's important for the parliament to do something very simple, which is to basically bring its own procedures in line with those of the outside world. So if you take one example, the EU has adopted a whistleblower directive, which basically provides protection to people who expose wrongdoing in relation to the spending of EU funds or the application of EU legislation. And so if people do that and they stick to the national legislation that implements that directive, then they are protected from being persecuted, from being harassed, from being fired. And those protections, for instance, don't apply to the staff of MEPs themselves, which is obviously very strange. It's not unknown. I mean, it's known, for instance, in the United States that the members of Congress always used to have excellent healthcare benefits when those healthcare benefits aren't available to the general population. And so politicians have a bit of a knack of making carve-outs for themselves when it comes to applying the law, to making the law. In this particular case, the law does apply, but MEPs simply haven't done it. And we want the parliament to make sure that those protections are introduced so that wrongdoing can be revealed. And why is this so important? It's important because we think that if you look at the scandal of Qatargate, there must have been lots of people inside the European Parliament who were aware of what's going on, or at least a piece of what was going on. And if these people had felt able to report what they found without fear of being fired or otherwise undergoing negative consequences of their actions, we think this would have been stopped in its tracks much sooner. So that's one example. Another example is the fact that MEPs receive a monthly allowance of almost 5,000 euros for office expenses, but they're not required to submit any receipts for that. They basically get the lump sum into their bank account, and there's no rules on how to spend it, or at least they don't have to justify how they spend it, which is absurd. What workplace in the world, in a democratic country, do you have a situation where people get a lump sum of money to cover expenses and don't have to provide any justification? And we're not saying that most MEPs are not spending this money the way they should be doing. They probably are, but the public has a right to know how they're spending it. They're allowed, that there should be receipts, there should be audits, and yet the parliament thinks that it can exempt itself from these kind of normal everyday world rules. And there's two problems in that. One is the hypocrisy and the double standards of applying one rule to them and one rule to us. The other is that I think it also contributes to a climate in which the kind of greed that drove Qatargate becomes easier and becomes more likely and more attractive. I think if you know that becoming a member of the European Parliament means that you get lots of cash that you don't need to justify spending, then you also attract the kind of people who are interested in getting lots of cash and who are greedy. And again, I'm not saying this is the case at all for the majority of MEPs who are hardworking, dedicated, and committed to their work. But I think there's definitely a rotten core of people who are there for the wrong reasons and who are susceptible to the kind of bribery or other financial inducements that we've seen in Qatargate.
That's really rather disturbing. Maybe we'll come back to that also Morocco dimension if people would like to raise it. But perhaps moving on to another area, Ukraine. I know that Transparency International does its rankings And before the war began, I think Ukraine was very close to the bottom of the rankings, with only Russia worse in Europe, and about Belarus. And now, of course, the EU moved very quickly, given this sort of geopolitical challenge, and gave candidate status very quickly by its standards to Ukraine. And we've heard recently the Ukrainian president really expressing his wish that actual negotiations could get started with the EU even this year, he said, spelling out the year 2023, you know, how realistic that may be or not. But of course, there are many obstacles to this. But one of the obstacles is the perception, at least, that Ukraine is mired in corruption. So the government is pressing the accelerator for a program to really fight corruption. But how plausible is this, especially in wartime? And what would it take, you know, for a country like Ukraine to reform itself fundamentally when it comes to very ingrained habits of corruption at different levels of society?
Okay.
Sorry, just a little, you know.
Yeah. No, so obviously very good and important question which lots of people are looking at these days. I mean, I think to start with, in a way, the simplest part of the answer is that one part of the accession process involves making sure that you implement EU legislation and that you adhere to certain standards when it comes to democracy, human rights, rule of law, as you well know, and the fight against corruption and making sure that you have adequate arrangements in place against corruption, that you have certain safeguards that corruption can't happen, or that when it does happen, it's detected and punished. That's essential in order to be able to become a member of the European Union. And obviously, this is one of the things that we as a Brussels office for TI will be looking at very closely. We want to make sure that if and when Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, it has the right tools and the right safeguards and the right mechanisms to address corruption, and it's got a track record of doing that. And we are fully in agreement there with our national chapter in Ukraine. And our national chapter in Ukraine, has told us very clearly that they are very keen for the EU to be tough on corruption when it comes to Ukrainian accession, because for them, the EU being tough on corruption and other countries being tough on corruption on Ukraine helps them to bring about the necessary reforms in Ukraine that will make that happen. So we're completely aligned there with our counterparts and civil society at large in Ukraine when it comes to the need to do it and the will to do it. Of course, how to do it is much more complicated. Now, I just want to make one sort of just sidestep slightly into our analysis of corruption worldwide and how we do that, because the tool we use for that, the main tool we have for that, is the Corruption Perceptions Index, as you know, which was the latest edition was published last month, and the Corruption Perceptions Index looks only at public sector corruption, and it does so on the basis of perceptions, and it does so on the basis of information collected in the last 2 years. So the information is always slightly behind, if you like. We don't have the latest up-to-date information. Our analysis covers, it's a meta-analysis of analyses that have been covered for the last 2 years. So progress that's made in fighting corruption isn't immediately visible, or is visible only in small incremental steps. It normally takes a number of years before you see that progress has really been achieved. We see that in the reverse with, for instance, a country like Hungary, which has taken its time to go down our rankings, but now has finally reached the bottom of all EU member states, which I think is where people would pretty much expect it to be after the last decade or so. So reality,
it has some competition.
It does have some competition, but that's true. But it's now reached the bottom of the EU member states in the ranking. Ukraine has made improvements when it comes to fighting corruption, but clearly has a long way to go yet. The reason I mentioned the way the index is built up and the way we look at corruption is that what the index doesn't look at is private sector corruption. And if you look at the problem of corruption in countries in South America, in Africa, in Asia, those are often corruption problems that are linked to the activity of Western companies that are active in those countries. So yes, it's the public official in the African country that's accepting the bribe, but it's the Western company that's paying the bribe. So it's important to, and that also applies, of course, in terms of a country like Ukraine, other countries. It's also important to bear in mind that in order for someone to be bribed, there has to be someone willing to bribe, and that's not a problem that's restricted to Ukraine. And in fact, many of the biggest corruption scandals in the world have been private sector scandals. Think about Danske Bank, for instance, which played a huge role in money laundering. But kind of Denmark doesn't get blamed for that, because in the Corruption Perception Index, Denmark ranks at the top. So that's important to bear in mind. Now, in terms of how to deal with it, and I'll try to be brief. I think the main way to deal with this is prevention, right? Because I think that if you have to deal with corruption based on detecting it, identifying the culprits, taking them to court, punishing them, and that acting as a deterrent, yes, that all helps. But it's an incredible amount of work. It requires huge resources from law enforcement in order to do it. So the best way is clearly to provide is to prevent it. And partly that's about awareness raising. It's about education. Things which can done through the education system, but also through the training of law enforcement staff themselves, who are often involved in this, and making sure that people are that you create a culture in which corruption becomes unacceptable. A second way of making sure that happens is to provide transparency. So to make sure, for instance, that public procurement is done in a transparent way, that everybody can see on a government website which projects are put out to tender, who's bidding, what the bids are, so that we know exactly what is going on, and to publish that information in open data format, so that organizations such as ours, but also the media, can download the information and analyze it. And if you make sure that as many as possible of these processes that are vulnerable to corruption are conducted in public with as much civil society oversight as possible, it just becomes a lot harder.
And is that already, has there been progress on that? Is that already the case, or is this an aspiration? I mean,
there has been, and I'm not a country expert on Ukraine, so but I know that in Ukraine there's been progress on the electronic publication of tenders. Of course, with the war, there's a problem that for national security reasons, countries decide that in times of war, certain information cannot and should not be published. And in certain respects, they probably have a point. The worry, of course, is that can be used as an excuse to deprive the public of information, even of information that isn't subject to this kind of sensitivity. But absolutely, progress has been made. We, as Transparency International EU, are part of an organization called Rise Ukraine, which is an international coalition that is striving to bring exactly this kind of transparency and accountability to Ukraine when it comes to the rebuilding of Ukraine, because we're all aware of the fact that when this war ends, and hopefully it will end soon, there's going to be a huge international effort required to rebuild Ukraine. There's going to be vast sums of money involved, and we already need to start planning now to make sure that money is spent effectively and wisely, and isn't wasted or lost to corruption. And in order to do that, we're working together with this coalition to try and make sure that the tools are built and are in place, and that the rules are agreed, to make sure that when the money arrives for that reconstruction effort, it is spent it is used in a transparent way that makes the risk of corruption, certainly large-scale corruption, as small as possible.
That's good to know there has been progress, and certainly Zelensky's thrown himself into it, and for public presentation anyway. I mean, remains to be seen, in my view, whether the member states are ready to go along with the view that this is enough, for example, to give a green light to start the negotiations, or whether it's an excuse. We'll see where we go with that.
I think, just on that point, if I may, Michael, I think the reality is that it's a political and a politicized process, and I think that it's inevitable that that in the case of Ukraine, this promise has been made in a way that would not have been made to any other country wishing to join the European Union. It was sent as a signal to obviously to Russia and to make it clear that we see Ukraine's destiny as being in Europe. And so I think that from the gesture point of view, that makes complete sense. But it does not mean that we should lower our guard or lower our standards when it comes to the admission process, because that wouldn't be in our interest. It also wouldn't be in Ukraine's interest.
I know opinions, not to dwell on this for too long, but opinions in Brussels are really divided on this. I talked to some people who would normally be enlargement skeptics, like one or two Belgians, for example, who are very hesitant about enlargement. And they think that the geopolitical challenge is so vast this time that the EU is like to overcome these hesitations and, if not give a fast track, at least move much more quickly than they would otherwise. Whereas others are on the side of caution, and the traditional concerns that plus public opinion, obviously, in our own countries. But the court is out. Before opening up to general discussion, comments, questions, I'd just like to ask you about a third sort of geographic focus, which is very much our concern these days, of course, and that is after the terrible tragedy in Turkey and in Syria. And coming very much to the fore now is the view that, yes, this was one of the worst, or perhaps the worst, humanitarian tragedy within the past decades in Europe, wider Europe anyway. But like so many disasters, it's at least partly man-made. And now we're seeing the government in Turkey especially throwing responsibility for what has happened in part onto local authorities, onto contractors, and so on. When, a look at this would rather suggest that you've got 20 years of corruption when it came to issuing building permits and making sure that anti-seismic rules codes were being properly implemented and all of that. So, and there are elections coming up in just 3 months or 4 months in Turkey. So it's extremely sensitive. But do you think, knowing what we know now, and we're still pursuing the matter further, that this is a tragedy that, at least in part, can be attributed to the kind of things we're talking about this evening?
Yes, I think so. I was really struck by a comment which some of you may have seen as well, by the mayor of a coastal town in Turkey called Erzin, which is in the quake area. And this mayor said that there had been no deaths in his town because he'd always refused illegal building projects. And now I'm not an expert on earthquakes or on Turkey particularly, but so I have no way of knowing what the impact of corruption is overall, but certainly it seems that if you're looking at what the experts are saying, there are a lot of building projects in Turkey that were basically granted permission without the requisite safeguards, without proper building permission, without proper engineering approvals underlying the project, and that a lot of the deaths in the quake may be attributed to the fact that project developers were basically allowed to build these developments, probably in return, in many cases, for favors or bribes to local politicians, and that thousands of deaths could have been prevented had those buildings never been built, or had been built according to the appropriate standards for an area that is known to be prone to earthquakes. And it's just a reminder that first, it's obviously it's tragic, and it shows that corruption can have huge consequences. I mean, we often think about corruption as Qatargate type corruption, as in big cases of cash being handed from one individual to the other with limited impact on other individuals. But this is a really clear example of how corruption can have a devastating societal impact, and impact literally the lives of thousands. And that can be said for corruption when it comes to other areas of life as well. A lot of the huge societal problems that we face can be traced, at least in part, back to corruption. If you think, for instance, about the fact that by some estimates, 30% of the wood used to make furniture, the furniture that we buy, comes from forests that have been basically cut illegally, and often as the result of bribes being paid. So yeah, if you tackle corruption, that has a knock-on effect on your ability to deal with other big societal issues.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not an earthquake specialist either, but in recent years, I've spent some time in Chile, where my wife is from, and I'm in New Zealand. And I was in New Zealand shortly after the Christchurch earthquake. And there were sort of 30,000 plus homes destroyed in that earthquake. But there were only about, I think, 130 people. I mean, every life lost is a tragedy, who died. And over 100 of them were in one building. And this building was, I think, a Chile building. And then it turned out that the architect or the planner who had designed the building had falsified his credentials, wasn't really qualified, and that building collapsed. And but in every other case, not. And in Chile, earthquakes maybe not on this proportion, but are extremely frequent. And I think there's now 20, 30, 40 years of anti-seismic codes being implemented. I don't know what Chile is in terms of the Transparency International Code. It's not perfect, but I don't think it's near the bottom. And it can be done, I think, and where corruption is not overwhelming, I think there's just a much better chance of correct, better governance being pursued. I've got loads more questions, but I think I'll leave it now for there. I don't know if you'd like to add anything before we go to people's possible questions.
No, let's hear this question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks for being so open. And, could I invite you both in the room and online, if you have questions and or comments, if you'd first briefly introduce yourselves, and then we'll take it from there. So, okay, we'll begin in the front row. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Aya. I more have like a comment around the situation with Turkey. I know I think in 1999 with the previous massive earthquake Turkey had, like right after they implemented a earthquake tax to help prevent future prevention or provide more infrastructure towards that. And I think it gained against a revenue around in the millions or billions. I forget the exact amount. But I know when Erdogan was asked, where did this money go after the earthquake hit, I think he said something about it went to a road or a highway, which I don't know how you earthquake proof a road, but that's what he said. But I know the speculation is that a lot of this money from tax revenues then went to other contractors or in the political pockets of government officials. And then contractors were given permission to build complexes and apartments that were not up to code that would have been used from the money gained from the infrastructure from the taxes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another example of the fact that you often need a big crisis in order to trigger real soul searching about what's going on. And I think again, Katake led to that in the European institutions. I think when you look at Russia, it's the invasion of Ukraine that finally led people to start looking at Putin in a sort of clear-eyed way and looking not just at what he was doing in Ukraine, but also what he's been doing to his country, where people have been saying, a lot of people say for a long time, have been warning about what's going on, but it's not something that the general public discusses or is concerned about until there's an explosion, literally almost of public concern. I think it looks like that may be happening in Turkey as well, where people are finally now that all of this is happening, starting to question the whole way Erdogan has conducted himself and, has allegedly enriched his cronies and handed out public contracts without tender processes, has condoned the system in which there were no proper building permits issued. And yeah, that's all now coming together, and people are going to start asking questions about what he did and why. And it looks like a definite moment of reckoning.
And it's a tremendous effort to control media coverage. Various social media pages blocked, and an effort really to throw responsibility on local authorities, on companies. I mean, they had this amnesty scheme, which was a state scheme where companies could pay to the government, and in exchange they would be exonerated from following rules in the building code. So it's very difficult then to put the responsibility just on local authorities, but with the elections pending, super sensitive. And let's see where we go with that. Veronica.
Thank you. That was excellent to hear. I just want to say that
Professor Angle.
right. One of my first internships was with Vote Watch in Bucharest in Romania. And that's when I learned that you can access how EU parliamentarians vote and so on. And that was really, really interesting to see. So it also speaks about transparency, and it's great to see that you're now actually in the Transparency International, which is something that I want to talk about. This index that Transparency International puts out measures perceptions of corruption. So it doesn't directly measure corruption, but we do use the idea of the perception of, so it uses citizens as a barometer of what's happening in their countries. But we do use it as a proxy for trust in institutions. And that's important because the higher the perception of corruption, the lower the trust in institutions at the citizens level, which has knock-on effects on everything from turnout to the trust in vaccine intake and so on. And we could see those effects directly in people's lives. My question to you would be, what is your expectation related to kind of this two-tier causal mechanism related to the scandal that is happening at the level of the European Union on perceptions of corruption at the national level? What would be your assumption? And how do you think this would affect your index in the next years as you look at it further?
Well, so we do two types of survey. One is the Corruption Perceptions Index, which looks at the perceptions of, so that's the meta-analysis, and that looks at the perception of corruption as seen by experts and by businesses. So that's I think the source. There are 13 different reports that are used for that, and a country is included in the ranking if it is at least in 3 of those. If it's part of the ranking, these 3 of those reports. That's like the Economist Intelligence Unit, the Freedom House ranking, the Bertelsmann Foundation ranking. There's a set of 13 of those sources for that, and so that's based purely on the views of experts and business people. And then we have a separate tool, which is the Global Corruption Barometer, and that is based purely on citizen perceptions of corruption. And in a way, that's probably a better gauge of the temperature when it comes to of how people feel about corruption in a particular geographic area. And in fact, we did one for the European Union 2 years ago, and the findings for that, I think, were not altogether that surprising, although they're probably still quite shocking in the sense that I think they felt that two-thirds of citizens in the EU felt that corruption was a problem in their the public corruption was a problem in their country. And in terms of how the EU level scandal will filter through to the national level, I don't know. My feeling is that on the whole, people tend to distinguish between the European level and the national level pretty well, at least in the short term. The longer term, I think, is harder to measure. I think that if you get a stream of stories coming out of Brussels of corruption happening all the time, then at some point, I think people might start, thinking that this is a general problem in politics and not just at the national level. But I almost see more the opposite now, which is that certainly when I'm interviewed, as I often am in the Netherlands on this issue, that people almost use it as a way of convincing themselves that things at home aren't so bad because things are really bad in Europe. That's where things are bad. And national politics, we as a country actually do quite well because these kind of things don't happen in our parliament. I think that's probably more of the reaction than to conflate the two and also see national politics as tainted with it. Of course, this is of course completely unjustified. I mean, again, yeah, I'm pretty confident there's no suitcases of cash in the Dutch Parliament, but when it comes, for instance, to lobby rules, the rules in Brussels are much better than they are in the Dutch Parliament. It's much easier for a Dutch parliamentarian to get away with a cozy relationship with the lobbyist than it is for a member of the European Parliament. So because there are many more safeguards in place, and that goes back to the point we raised at the beginning. The fate of the European institutions is to be subject to more scrutiny when it comes to wrongdoing. The result is that they've adopted more rules in order to address it. And as we've seen now, they don't always deal with it effectively. But it's absolutely the case that the European Union's institutions have an ethics and integrity framework in place that, while far from perfect, is still a lot better than that of most national political systems.
Yeah, I mean, during my time in Brussels, when I was recruited, there was nothing, for example, by way of training in ethics and integrity. Now it's obligatory, I think, for all new officials, training courses are training. But just the same, I think it does influence the ethos of an institution, and little by little, it does have its effect. Yeah, we have several requests for the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Carolina, and my question actually relates to what you just said. So in the first few minutes, you said that the European institutions have to perform better than the national institutions. And I think I agree with that. But I ask myself, how are they supposed to perform better if they consist at least in part of exact these national institutions, and for certain they represent the national interests? So there's kind of a conflict of interest if we say we want to implement policies against corruption, but at the same time we maybe have the people there who benefit from corruption.
There's always been a big sort of tension in Brussels with people saying that because we have all these different national political cultures, it's very difficult to arrive at a single European political culture. And just because just because one country has strong rules against corruption and strong rules in favor of transparency, doesn't mean that those rules should be imposed on the rest of the EU. And certainly when I was in EU politics as a member of the European Parliament, we always used to be seen as the Swedes, the Danes, the Dutch, the Brits. They were the ones who wanted more transparency, and everybody else is like, just like, do this at home if you want, but don't bother us with it. That's not how we do things. And to some extent, understandably, because probably the way we Northwestern Europeans go about telling the rest of Europe and the rest of the world how things should be done isn't always equally pleasant or collegial. I mean, it could be quite hectoring, I suppose, in a way. And on top of that, of course, we don't get everything right anyway. Just because we've got those rules in place doesn't mean that we have adhere to the highest standards of ethics and integrity. But that clash between political cultures has also been used as an excuse. It's also been an easy excuse to say, look, just because to say we've gone for different cultures, so let's just not try and merge them. Let's just each stick to our own culture and accept this European diversity. And that's also, I think, that's also not acceptable, because the reality is the EU institutions have been around for decades now. People have been working there for decades. There is a European administrative culture, I would say, and even to some extent the European polity, a demos of politicians who've been active at the European level, people who are internationalists, who are used to dealing with international relations, whether it's in business or in the private sector or in politics. And so, I think it's perfectly possible to come to a set of rules that we all think are acceptable. There are UN conventions on corruption. There's an OECD convention. I mean, we can, if it's possible to reach these kind of agreements on the global stage, then it must also be possible for members of the European Parliament or the European Commission or the Council of Ministers to agree on a common set of rules that should apply in Brussels. So I think there's also been too much of people hiding behind that argument. And in fact, one of the key reforms that we're pushing for now is the setting up of an ethics body that would cover at least the three main institutions in Brussels, so the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission, and that would set up a common ethics framework with common rules that would be applied in a harmonized way by all the institutions to make sure, one, that there's consistency, but also two, that there's effective enforcement, and that it's no longer up to one institution to enforce its rules internally, because the reality is that we've seen that this doesn't happen, or not to the extent necessary. And I'm a big fan of the European Parliament, so I don't want to criticize the Parliament all the time. So I'll say something about the Commission. But one of the big problems that the European Commission has is revolving doors. It's a problem of, partly it's when people retire. It's not the ones who go to Bologna to teach, but the people who retire and.
We've got a pizza dinner this evening. I hope it doesn't corrupt us.
But senior civil servants say someone working on energy policy who retires and then goes to work for an energy company. And there are too few controls. The same is true for former commissioners, former president of the commission who goes to work for Goldman Sachs. These are not things that are strictly speaking against the rules, and partly because the rules aren't strong enough, but also because they're not being enforced. And we just need to make sure that the institutions stick to higher standards when it comes to these issues, because they're setting an example, and it also impacts the way they function. I saw actually one interesting recent example is that apparently the Commission is planning to make it harder, or has already decided to make it harder, for its staff to take a leave of absence to work for an industry interest and then to come back to the Commission. And where this has been a particular problem has been, for instance, staff in the competition department to deal with major competition cases, going to work for a law firm, competition law firm, taking all their knowledge of how the Commission works with them, even if it's not on individual cases, at least on how the Commission functions on these cases, and then monetizing that knowledge when they join the private sector, and then to go back to the Commission in time for their retirement. And again, it's not this is not the majority of officials, but these are the kind of issues that have to be addressed, as well as the cases full of cash that so capture the public imagination.
Thank you. Quite a few further requests. Yes, we'll just move back across the room. Why don't you begin, and then we'll come.
Thank you. I'd be curious about your assessment on the actual impact of Qatargate on EU policymaking. And as a follow-up on that, given the power structure of the EU institutions, why the Parliament? It almost seems like a very high risk, but low return or possible return, given what they can actually maybe achieve through policymaking in the Parliament. Maybe because it's the easiest way in, and they didn't manage it to get into the Commission or the Council. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think you've already given part of the answer when you said maybe it's the easiest way in. I certainly think that's part of the answer. And the European Parliament prides itself, I think, rightly on being the most accessible of the European institutions. It's relatively easy to physically enter the European Parliament and to meet members of Parliament, meet staff. So absolutely, I think that if you want to engage with policymakers and do so in a way that is not too obvious to a general audience, then going to the European Parliament is a pretty good way to do it. I think your argument in a way works both ways. I think you could also, your argument, why go to the least important institution? I think you could also argue, well, maybe the fact that this is happening also shows that the Parliament is maybe a little bit more important now than it used to be. And so it's become more interesting for outside interests, whether it's their legitimate ones or illegitimate ones, to try and influence the process that's going on there. And if you look at the sums that are spent on lobbying the European Parliament by outside interest, we're talking billions, right? So it's that just goes to show that there is to me that goes to show that people are interested in that process. And I think that, also speak from personal experience, and having watched the Parliament evolve over the last couple of decades, it's clearly got its weight has increased in the policymaking process, become more important, become more powerful on paper, but also in reality. Now, in terms of how much Qatargate or the lobbying, the alleged lobbying, I think we start to say by in undue influence by Qatar and other countries, how much impact that's had. I suspect it hasn't been decisive in the sense that I don't think that's completely changed the direction of where the EU institutions were going, but I think it's had an impact. And I would say that I certainly think that that the Parliament would have been a lot more critical about the World Cup being held in Qatar had it not been for this process taking place. I think the people who were bribed were successful in impacting the policy process. I think that just looking at what happened and looking also and thinking back to what the Parliament was saying at the time, because I remember thinking at the time, as an ordinary citizen, why isn't the European Parliament being more forceful? You hear what they're saying, they're human rights defenders, why not be more forceful? It seemed odd at the time. And so, yes, I think it's had an impact. And I think that one of the things that has to come out of this is a very critical look, not so much at obviously, bribery as such, which obviously is illegal and you can be prosecuted for, but all these cases of people going on paid for trips. And that's not just the Parliament, that's people in the Commission as well. Sort of all expenses paid trips to a third country, which often is defended out of sort of as it's a courtesy thing to do. People host you and they pay for your hotel, and I think that if you have, especially if you have big policy discussions going on, as there were with Qatar, on issues like visa liberalization, but also on the Free Skies agreements, it's not appropriate for an EU policymaker to go to Qatar on an all expenses paid trip by the Qatari government. It's a clear conflict of interest. It's not banned at the moment. And I think, one of the things that we've said as a result of this crisis, one of the things that we said as Transparency International, is that we think those kind of trips should be banned. Doesn't mean you can't go to Qatar, but if you go to Qatar, you do so with your own funds as a member of Parliament, or with the funds of that the Parliament provides you with. But if you think it's important enough to go as part of your policy-making role, then funding should be provided for you to make that trip. And we can't continue with the current system where it's entirely up to the individuals themselves and it's entirely self-policing.
Right. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. And my question kind of,
Introduce yourself, please.
yes. Hi, my name is Katerina. My question operates a little bit on an assumption. So, correct me if I'm wrong. But if you are measuring perceptions of corruption, how can you accurately differentiate from hostile actors that try to exacerbate those perceptions, for example, through disinformation in order to erode trust in EU institutions, like primarily coming from Russia, sometimes from China?
Yeah, I mean, disinformation is clearly a huge problem. And I mean, one thing we did a couple of years ago was we discovered more or less by chance that Huawei was engaged in a social media campaign using basically fake accounts and fake actors in order to push a certain narrative to a European policy audience. And they literally created fake executives, vice presidents of this and that for Huawei Europe, to push the message out. And we detected this. A number of journalists looked into it, and the whole net was exposed. But what transpired was that there was a whole network that had been set up by Huawei, including fake websites, fake profiles, all with an effort to and paying publications, supposedly objective news publications to publish their information, all with the aim of influencing the policy-making process. And that's just one example of that we happen to come across. But I think there's quite a few of those things going on in Brussels, absolutely. And when you talk about the Corruption Perceptions Index, so I think there's clearly a risk there because, as I explained, it's based on the perceptions of experts and business people, and experts and business people are also people who are subjected to information and so also disinformation. So absolutely. The only thing I would say about that is that I think that because they are experts, they are probably better able to identify which information is reliable and which information is not reliable, compared to, say, citizens who are giving their perception in a survey without having had to put any thought or research into the opinions that they're giving. And I mean, one striking example of that always comes to mind for me is that you know, MH17, the flight that was shot down over eastern Ukraine. 300 people were on board, 200 were Dutch who died. And yet somehow, within 2 years, the Russians had managed to conduct a disinformation campaign in the Netherlands that led a lot of people in the Netherlands to question whether it wasn't really Ukraine that had brought the plane down, and that questioned whether the Dutch government wasn't in cahoots with the Ukrainian government in trying to hide the real facts behind this shooting down of that particular plane. Now, since then, there's been a court case and there's been an invasion, and that's kind of changed perceptions back. But I was, you know, disheartened, but also shocked to see how easy it was to influence an entire country with some really simple, basically simple disinformation tools. So yes, clearly that plays that plays a role. And what we're seeing now also in relation to Qatargate, but also another specific case is that, sure, the countries that don't wish the EU well are weaponizing this information. You know, the Hungarian government loved Qatargate, and they've been using it to accuse the EU of hypocrisy. And just recently, there was a newspaper publication about Polish MEP Sikorski and external funding he receives for a side job advising the United Arab Emirates. That's being massively exploited by the Polish government and Polish government-friendly media because he belongs to an opposition party in Poland. And yeah, and that's you know, that's that I think it's very unfortunate that it's being exploited, because we also go back to the fact that if there hadn't been the issue in the first place, it couldn't have been exploited. So you know, and that's the case with you know, the EU institutions in general. We often get accused when there are big scandals or crises like these of being anti-European, of helping the anti-European cause, of feeding Euroscepticism, etc. And yes, we are aware of the fact that these crises feed Euroscepticism, but we're not the ones doing the feeding. We're exposing the problem. The feeding is being done by the institutions that don't have the safeguards in place to prevent these scandals happening in the first place. And if you want to tackle it, and if you want to prove the Eurosceptics wrong, then you need to make sure that they don't have the ammunition that they're being provided with now by the institutions themselves to fight the institutions with.
Yeah, Professor Gilbert.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. You've probably noticed I've been following it with enormous interest. I wrote a bit about corruption in Italy many years ago, and it was my perception the old Italian political system was not so much Italians being corrupt as a knowledge that they wouldn't be punished. I think if you have a circumstance in which everybody knows sooner or later everybody will be amnestied, or the legal code is such that you can drag things out until you never go to prison. I mean, if you look at Tangentopoli in the early 1990s, there were thousands of politicians who took very large sums of money. Very few of them actually did jail time. And I was quite struck as you were talking that you didn't talk much about legal systems and punishment. And I was wondering what you thought was necessary in that respect.
Well, our main concern is the fact that that the EU institutions are basically self-policing, and that leads to a situation which I think is, in a way, quite natural, which is that people try and protect their own, and you'd rather deal with a problem internally than share it with the outside world. I mean, we know, for instance, also that there's been huge problems in universities, for instance, with case of sexual harassment, which haven't been dealt with quickly enough or effectively enough, because there's been this tendency to close ranks and to try and deal with the problem internally and not have it impact relations with the outside world. And I think the EU institutions in that respect are not very different, but it is problematic. We did a report not so long ago, several years ago, but where I think we found that there have been 24 cases in 1 year of MEPs being alleged to have broken the rules on providing financial information regarding their work, and only 1 out of those 24 had been sanctioned. And that sends a signal that you can do this, you can get away with it. And if the entire system is based around that, then that becomes the accepted culture, which is why we've been arguing for this ethics body, but we've also been arguing, for instance, for extending the powers of OLAF, the EU's anti-fraud agency, which at the moment is very limited in what it can do in relation to MEPs and their officers, because they have all sorts of legal protections, and partly because they give themselves more protections than they legally have. So that's important. We need to make sure that that the European Public Prosecutor is effective and has the resources that they need. The European Public Prosecutor has only just started work. I think it was last year now or 2 years ago, but something that's been a long time in the making. And in a way, all that infrastructure was missing at the European level. We were completely reliant in a way on the Belgian authorities when it came to problems in Belgium, because that's the way the law is set up for dealing with these cases at the European level. And frankly, I think national authorities will probably often have more important things to worry about than whatever international institution happens to be based on their territory. Let them sort their own problems out. So the fact that we've now built up this a number of institutions or agencies at the European level that are specifically designed to tackle fraud and corruption in the institutions and other forms of wrongdoing, and to prepare files for prosecution by national authorities is already a huge step in the right direction. So I think that's the real big step forward that's been taken. And I think that will also make it easier for national authorities to act when there are cases that have been detected. But it remains an imperfect system, and the fact that that we're dealing with 27 different countries, and we're also dealing with members in the case of members of the European Parliament, or with people with parliamentary immunity, it makes it much harder to prosecute. And there's a big discussion going on about the fact of do they need this protection? Should they have this protection? There are some countries where members of parliament do have immunity from prosecution, but others where they don't. And so maybe it's time to take a fresh look at those arrangements, which are maybe a bit outdated.
Yeah. We've got time for 1 or 2 last questions. Maybe I missed someone towards the back, but anyone there like to come in? If we have 1 question online, maybe we'll end with that. And it's a question about how we deal with non-democratic governments. And another question about that too. I mean, on Qatargate, we've really been focusing on, who was taking the money. But what about who's giving the money? And, do we have any leverage at all? Well, you mentioned companies, but what about governments, non-democratic governments? Is there anything we could or should be doing about them? Or do we just have to accept that this is part of their normal practice and focus on our own citizens and how they respond?
It's a good point. And actually, our big concern when Qatargate scandal broke in December was the opposite, which is that President Metsola of the European Parliament gave a speech in which he said our democracy is under attack. The European Parliament is under attack. She literally used those words, and she was referring to those third countries. And while of course we completely disapprove of what those countries have been doing allegedly, we were a bit concerned at the time that the blame was shifted entirely on the third country actors, and that the Parliament was basically absolving itself of responsibility fortunately, the balance there has shifted, and the parliament is now looking seriously at its own internal affairs and how to prevent future crises. But clearly, there is a problem with the way third country actors have behaved, and it's allegedly a range of countries that have been doing this. And if we're now doing research, others are doing research. If you look at things like which MEPs have written favorable op-eds about repressive regimes in recent years, that probably gives you a good starting point for an investigation that might lead you to
Students are looking around for a subject for their term paper. I think
well, there's lots of it. We can help you provide you with some questions to look into if that's the case. But so yeah, I think it's a problem, and one of the things that comes out of this crisis that there are lots of investigations going on. We are investigating, others are investigating, and I expect that a lot more will come out between now and the elections on specific cases of undue influence that have been going on in the last few years. I mean, I suspect that if there are, I suspect that most will have stopped by now in the light of Qatargate. But I think there's certainly a lot of evidence that other countries have been behaving in a similar way in the past, and of course that needs to be tackled. Now, there's always sensitivities. With a country like Qatar, we need its gas, right, to replace the Russian gas. So is it the lesser of two evils? There's clearly foreign policy considerations on how to deal with a country like that, just as we never know how to deal with Saudi Arabia.
Algeria, Morocco.
With Morocco, we also need to agree with them on migration, so we can't be too, so there's always those considerations. But on a smaller level, one of the things that's being that will happen in Brussels is that there will be much stricter controls on what third countries can do in terms of lobbying, and making sure that when they go to the European Parliament, they can't just walk in there with their diplomatic badge. They have to register like other lobbyists, so that at least we get some kind of idea of what these what these third country actors are up to. But it's absolutely astonishing. I mean, I was in Strasbourg in January, and I was told then that even that there was a motion on a resolution motion for a resolution on Morocco being voted. I was told that there were Moroccan members of parliament outside the plenary chamber in Brussels still lobbying MEPs on how to vote in that resolution. This is after Qatargate. And I think it sounds like they had every right to be there. They had the right badge, etc. But this is clearly not a healthy thing to be happening in a democratic parliament.
Okay. Very, very last. Looking at the watch, so we
Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Seychelles, they rank higher than democracies like Italy, Czechia, that have their problems. So I'm just wondering whether there isn't a normalcy bias somewhere in the experts or in the people who are analyzing these authoritarian regimes to claim there's not that much corruption, maybe because that's just the way things are being done. And the reason I'm asking this is because such an instrument is an agenda setter as well. So people would use it to consider maybe their business practices and so on. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, that's a really difficult question you asked me right at the end. Thank you very much. It's a constant debate on the CPI, as we call it, and it's a debate that's had every year, and it's clearly an imperfect instrument. And if you read the full report and all the disclaimers and the methodology, it will tell you that these are subjective views, and it's the imperfect document, and you can't necessarily make a like-for-like comparison for each country. It gives you a sense of how things are in relation to a country, but it's a subjective. Even though it's a meta-analysis, it's still a meta-analysis of subjective views taken by specific experts, specific people from business, and so it's impossible to say that objectively speaking you can compare like for like. I'd be very concerned if you were able to say this about the top 10 and the middle section, or the bottom section and the middle section, because then I think there'll be something fundamentally wrong with the way the whole thing is set up. But yeah, so I think it's really important to take it with a pinch of salt in that sense, and to accept the fact that that the comparisons aren't going to be perfect for every one-on-one comparison within the so pairing within the analysis.
Okay, I think we have to leave it there. Lots of unanswered questions. Thank you for being so frank, open, live. And thanks for coming down to Bologna at such a busy time. Hope to see you again, maybe in quieter moments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thanks.
It was really great.